may want to raise this a touch for you.
Harold's going to raise it for me because I'm kind of tall. But Harold, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I remember literally within hours after September 11th that day, you and I being together at a restaurant in New York City, talking about the horrible tragedy and what we were going to do to get through it. And there was no one in the city. It was like a ghost town. The people who had been there left. The firefighters, not just from New York, but all over the country, were pouring in. So I'll never forget that day, and I thank you very much for your friendship and your support on that day. You know, I wanted today to prepare a big, long speech so I could talk to you, but I got a little distracted by the news because I don't know if you've noticed, but there was something about Hillary Clinton and emails recently. And what a lot of you don't know is that Hillary and I email all the time. We did when I was governor and she was senator, and it continued just up to a few days ago. So I want to read you a couple of the emails that we got. First, when I was governor, I got this from Hillary a couple of years ago. Hey, Gov, how you doing? I'm leaving the White House dead broke. Think you can line up any six-figure speeches for me? And then there was a little smiley face at the end. But then I got one just a few weeks ago. Hey, George, OMG. Can you believe Brian Williams stealing my line about landing under enemy fire overseas? What a jerk. There was a little unhappy face after that. But she sent me a few on Benghazi, but they're classified. So I'm sorry, I can't let you know what they have to say. I did want to be here this morning, and when Steve Cassidy, a great friend, called and said, you know, hey, we're inviting you down, would you like to come? Immediately I said, yes, I will be there. And, you know, we just heard my good friend Peter King talking a lot about September 11th. And on that date, a lot of Americans learned for the first time what I knew since I was a kid, and that is that the heroes in this country are not somebody who can throw a pass 60 yards or dunk a basketball without effort. The heroes in this country are the men and women who put on a uniform, whether it's a military uniform, a firefighter's uniform, a police officer's uniform, and risk their lives every day to protect the freedoms that we take for granted. And without you, and without your fellow first responders and those who put on the uniform, we would not have the freedoms in this great country that we too often take for granted. Now, I knew that long before September 11th for a simple reason. My father was a very proud firefighter. I grew up in an upstate community on a little farm, and my father and I worked the farm, and he was a mailman and a firefighter. And he was a very dedicated one. And in fact, he was the only one in the history of my hometown to be captain of two different departments. And he was captain of one. And then another department in town got a hook and ladder truck. And this is before they had bucket trucks and safety belts and everything. It was just a long extension ladder. And you would run the hose up the ladder and direct it down on the fire. Now, we grew up on a farm. My father was on a ladder all the time. And they got the hook and ladder, but they couldn't get anybody to go up the end. It was too dangerous and too risky. So they said to my dad, hey, you're captain of that company. Come over. We're going to make you captain of ours. We need you. And I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old, there was a big fire downtown. And kids, when there's not much going on in your hometown and there's a fire, they get all excited. So we all ran down. And I remember my friends saying, wow, isn't this exciting? And as we sat there on a hill looking at the fires, I thought, no, this isn't exciting. This is really scary, because I knew it was my father who was up there at the end of the ladder. And the proudest picture I have today is not of me being sworn in as governor or anything else. It's a picture of my father that was given to me by one of his colleagues in the fire department. And it shows him in just a helmet, no masks or safety belts or anything back then, at the end of a ladder, and 2 feet from his face are the flames rising up while he is there directing the hose. So I learned when I was a child what Americans now know, and that is that those who put on the uniform to defend us, whether military or firefighters, are our true heroes. You know, Americans learned that on September 11th, and Peter King just talked to you about that, but there's not a day goes by, and I mean this sincerely, that the number 343 is not in my head. Every morning, every day, I get up and I look around, and at some time during the course of that day, that number pops to my mind, because that day is something I will never forget. Yes, there were New Yorkers fleeing. I was in New York that day, but we saw your colleagues, not just active duty colleagues, people who were off duty, people who were retired, flocking to Ground Zero. And of course, too many of them lost their lives. Now today, Harold mentioned how I had the honor of passing the law, and I'll tell you that was something I'm very proud of. You know, the World Trade Center presumptive bill. I signed that law, and let me just tell you a little bit about what it does. Right now in New York, if you served at Ground Zero and you retired, and then a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, 5 years later, all of a sudden your health deteriorated and you became disabled. It's the first time ever in the history of the country where there is now a law where a retired firefighter can go back and change their retirement to disability because of the injury, the health illness they suffered at Ground Zero. I was proud to sign that law. I was proud to sign that law, and I was proud to work with Steve Cassidy, who's a great leader and just a tremendous friend, when he came into office as president, to make sure we signed that law to protect the firefighters in our city. And I hope others take a look at it as a model of what they might want to have as well. Today in New York is Cardinal Egan's funeral. Cardinal Egan was the Cardinal of New York on September 11th. And I would be at his funeral, except I wanted to come here to talk to you. The morning of September 11th, after I got my emergency organization going and spoke to the mayor and made sure we were coordinating the state's response, I went over with my daughter, who was rattled, to St. Patrick's, and Cardinal Egan was there. And Cardinal Egan and I, just with my daughter, went off to a little side chapel in St. Patrick's and said a prayer for those who had gone into the towers, for those we had lost, and for our country, that we would get through not just that tragic day, but the aftermath of that day. In the weeks to follow, in the months to follow, Cardinal Egan and I attended too many funerals together. And I remember one on Staten Island. And you know, when there's a firefighter funeral or a police funeral, there's a grand turnout. You have the Emerald Society band. You have so many firefighters standing at attention as the family walks in. I'll never forget one funeral I went to on Staten Island for a firefighter who died that day. There was one bagpiper. There were a handful of firefighters standing at attention, and there were the family and friends of the firefighter who lost his life. So many funerals, so many tragedies, almost 3,000, that we couldn't have enough people turn out to pay appropriate respect at every funeral. And I vowed that day that we could never let this happen to America again. And you heard Peter King talk about the threat we face. Well, we cannot make the mistake we made before September 11th. We cannot think that because Islamic terrorists are thousands of miles overseas, that they don't pose a threat to us here in America. They do, and I honestly believe we are at greater risk today than at any time since September 11th, and you are the ones who would have to respond if another tragedy, another attack like that happens on American soil. You know, we have two failed models. One failed model, I believe, is this president today, who doesn't even recognize that Islamic terror exists. He won't call it by its name. And he is looking like we did, not learning the lesson of September 11th, that it's so far away, we don't have to be proactive to defend ourselves. Another failed model is we're going to spend $1 trillion, send hundreds of thousands of troops, and try to create a democracy where one hasn't existed before. I don't believe in that either. But think about the difference between ISIS today and Al-Qaeda on September 11th. Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan, remote, isolated. No modern weapons, no money, controlled no territory. The best weapon they had was a box cutter. And they committed that horrible attack on American soil. Think of ISIS today. Controls territory, hundreds of millions of dollars, sophisticated weapons. They have training camps and recruitment centers and social media headquarters and thousands of people with Western passports who could come back to attack us again. Now, I have two sons. One served as a Marine lieutenant in Iraq. My other got back in September serving as a lieutenant in Afghanistan with the 10th Mountain Division. I don't want to see us send one soldier more than necessary overseas in harm's way. But when I see ISIS posing this threat, when I remember what happened on September 11th by not being proactive, we have got to do whatever it takes to kill them over there before they have the chance to come back and kill us here. Yes, with allies. And by the way, any American political figure who compares ISIS to demonstrators exercising their constitutional right, and by the way, I had thousands of demonstrators when I was governor. Probably some of you in this room were picketing me at one point, but I always treated you with respect despite the differences. And any politician who compares ISIS, demonstrators to ISIS, compares those exercising their constitutional right to those who would attack us and kill us again, just is flat out wrong, period. You know, I'm here this morning because, one, I wanted to thank you for what you do and for the sacrifices you make, but also because this is a time when Americans should be so excited about our future. You know, I talked about growing up in a little town in upstate New York, and it was a very diverse town. We had rich and poor, white and black, Christian and Jew, every ethnic group imaginable. And yet every one of us, regardless of your background, believed that this was America. And whatever you dreamed could come true. It didn't matter whether your family was successful economically or not. In America, if you dreamed it and you worked, you could achieve it. And that was always the belief in this country. And think today, it should be the most exciting time when we look to the future with the greatest optimism ever. Imagine what's going to be happening over the next decade in medicine. We're going to have treatments that cure cancer. I honestly believe that extend life, that allow us to deal with diseases in the most creative and imaginative ways imaginable. We're going to see transportation change. We don't know what sort of fuel vehicles we'll be driving, or whether we'll be driving them or they'll be driving us. We're going to be seeing change in energy, where we are a global powerhouse exporting energy to other parts of the world. Americans today should be looking at the future and saying, wow, what an exciting time. And yet so many Americans today look to the future and doubt if tomorrow's going to be better than today. Doubt if their kids are going to have a better future than they do, and wonder whether or not the promise of the American dream is going to continue. Well, my answer to that is yes, because this is still America. And when I look across America and talk with people, it's not a failing of our people, of our society. We still have the greatest work ethic in the world. We have people like you willing to put your lives on the line to help serve others. What we don't have is a government as good as its people. Washington has grown too big, too powerful, too expensive, too intrusive, and is stealing from our future, from our children and their children's future to live beyond its means today, and it has to stop. I remember when I came to Washington as an 8th grader, and I was awed to be in this capital of our country where George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and so many other great leaders of our country had been. I come to Washington today, and it seems like it's an island apart from the rest of the country, a place of power and intrigue where too often they're talking to each other and ignoring the American people, where instead of understanding that the people should be telling the politicians in Washington what to do, the politicians in Washington too often tell us what we have to do, and it is wrong, and it has got to stop. We have to shrink the power, shrink the size not Homeland Security, not our military. We have to rebuild our military and strengthen it for the challenges of the 21st century. But we have to change dramatically the way Washington operates. Too many politicians think they are better than us, different than us. They have to remember they are our servants and not our masters. Let me just tell you a few of the changes I would make. You know, what happens now is you get elected to Congress, either party, any place in the country. You know within 6 months, if you play the game, you're set for life. Even if you don't get reelected, or if you decide not to run again, you can stay in Washington and make 10 times, 20 times as much as if you went back home to the community that sent you here. Washington is growing in power. 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America today surround Washington, D.C. They're not around New York, the financial capital, or LA, the entertainment capital, or Silicon Valley, the technology capital, or in the Midwest, the agricultural capital of the world. They surround this city. And this is a city where you don't produce anything except loopholes and exemptions and rules and credits and a tax code that is 74,000 pages of nonsense, incomprehensible to anyone. It has got to change, and let me tell you 3 proposals that I would advance that I believe can dramatically change our country and give it back to the people from the politicians. First, today there are over 400 former members of the House and Senate serving as lobbyists in Washington. I would pass a law right away. You serve 1 day or in the House or Senate, there is a lifetime ban on your ever being a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. Go back home. You're supposed to serve the people and not look to get a job here. Second of all, you don't do your job, you don't get paid. If they don't do their job, they shouldn't get paid. If they don't enact a budget as they're supposed to do, they should not get paid until their budget is adopted. And third, another reform. You know, they ran through Obamacare, supposed to be such a great law for the American people. It applied to every one of us. By the way, your health care plans are going to be at risk in a couple of years because they're so-called Cadillac plans. It was a great law for the American people, but not for Congress. They exempted themselves, and they exempted their staffs. Well, one reform, you pass a law that applies to the American people, and it applies to you and your staffs as well. The problem with the Cadillac tax would be gone right away. You know, I talked about, when I was growing up, believing that if you wanted to do something in America, regardless of your background, you could accomplish it. And that's what we have to achieve again today. And when I ran for governor, there were a lot of those who said, "Who? He's out of his mind?" And I just remember 2 days before the election. It was the Sunday night before the first election, and a poll had come out showing me 17 points behind Mario Cuomo. And it was a little hard to continue on the campaign trail, but I knew I had to get out there and make the case. And I remember that Sunday evening. I had an event, a rally in Staten Island, across the bay in New York City, and taking the ferry. And it was a beautiful evening. And as I went across to Staten Island, there was the Statue of Liberty. And I thought for a minute that all 4 of my grandparents had sailed past that statue. 3 of the 4 couldn't speak English. My grandmother spoke English, but it was with such an Irish brogue, nobody could understand her, including me, when I finally grew up. But they, as they passed that statue, would have thought, quite simply, you know, it's tough leaving our families, never to see them again. It's tough leaving the countries we were born and raised in, never to see it again. But they would have looked at that statue and said, but we made the right decision. There's the Statue of Liberty. America is the right place. When we marry and have children, and they have children, in America, anybody's dream can come true. And they would have been so proud, I thought that evening, that their grandson had the opportunity to run for governor of New York State. Maybe not win, but at least have the opportunity and the privilege of running. They made the right call. All of our ancestors who came to America made the right call. Well, there's a lot of doubt today about the future of America. But let me tell you something. The Statue of Liberty is still there. The torch still is lit of liberty. It may be clouded in fog sometimes where you can't see it clearly. There may even be clouds sometime where you can't see it at all, but it's still there. And if we reform Washington, if we get government back as the servants of the people and not its master, if we convince Americans that Washington must change so that they can believe and they can see that their dreams come true, then that torch will remain lit. And the dreams of every single person in America, whether they're born in Detroit, Des Moines, Denver, or anywhere, can come true. You represent that. You show that every day with your commitment. And I just wanted to be here to thank you for what you've done. Thank you for what you're going to continue to do. And let's stand together and make sure that the best of America is not behind us. It's ahead of us. Thank you very much. Great being with you this morning. Thank you.